Chapter 10. Considering that they still had Shepard's acolytes to deal with, Gibbons was just as glad to discover Shepard had apparently confiscated all firearms brought to Jerusalem's wall as a matter of course. A panicky mob was bad enough. An armed panicky mob was worse. More than a third of the fellowship were unaccounted for. They would probably come back at sunrise, since the ranch was the closest source of food and shelter. Most of the rest of them had decided to gather in the ranch house chapel to pray. Whether to be struck dead or forgiven, it was hard to say. The more Jett told her about Brother Shepard, the angrier Gibbons got. Not only had he been a bully and a killer, he'd let pride and greed corrode what seemed to have been a first-class scientific mind. For a while she'd wondered if the zombies might be proof that magic actually existed, but now Gibbons wasn't as sure. Sound had a measurable effect on a living body after all. At a high enough volume, it could even kill. Who was to say whether Shepard had resurrected dead bodies or simply drugged people into a deep coma and then used sound to control them? It was even possible the zombies had been truly dead, and the corpses host to some form of insect or parasite or bacterium not yet known to science. She wouldn't be able to hazard a guess until she could examine his laboratory in depth. She could begin tomorrow. But there was one matter that couldn't be allowed to wait, and with all her heart, Gibbons hoped Jett was wrong. She is not a trained observer, though I grant she is a good one, and the disciplines of science are as yet a closed book to her. But it is best to make sure. White Fox chose to remain above to ensure the safety of the autotachopode, a necessary precaution among a group of people who'd had every certainty destroyed in a few brief hours. Now, accompanied by Jett, Sister Catherine, and to Gibbons's faint surprise, half a dozen of the braver souls of the fellowship, Gibbons descended into what Brother Shepard had called his inner prayer house. According to Jett, Brother Shepard's Alamatons had built it. Gibbons wasn't sure she credited that, but it was an amazing piece of engineering all the same. A space vaster than the foyer of the San Francisco Opera House, carved by hand out of Texas limestone. The rooms were still brilliantly lit by lamps showing the blue-white smokeless flame of pure alcohol, and for a moment Gibbons wished they weren't. For the first room Jett led them to was filled with what Gibbons could only categorize as loot. Behind her, she could hear the unhappy murmurs of Shepard's former dupes. Though perhaps fortunately, they were all still too stunned to work up much in the way of shock or indignation. It was additional proof of Shepard's dishonesty and their own credulity, but to Gibbons it was more. It was her first real evidence of how long he had been left to build his empire of death and plunder beneath everyone's noses. Even if he'd done nothing more than follow the wagon trails to scavenge those items abandoned by travelers, and it did not matter how precious an heirloom had been loaded into the back of a Conestoga at Independence, Missouri, it became merely dangerous makeweight a few hundred miles west. It would have taken him years to acquire the contents of this room. And she knew he'd done more than that. Far more. But what? And for how long? Jett led them to a doorway at the far end of the chamber. She hung back, allowing the others to enter before her. The room wasn't as brightly lit as the other one. Gibbons smelled scorched wool as she crossed the threshold, and beneath it the unmistakable sharp, sick stench of zombie. I did hope she'd been wrong, Gibbons thought sorrowfully. He's alive, Sister Catherine cried. My boy is alive. In the cell at the end of the room, a boy perhaps 12 years old was pacing back and forth. When he saw them, he thrust both arms through the bars, his mouth open in a silent howl. Sister Catherine ran to him before Gibbons could even think of stopping her. You were wrong, you were wrong. Oh, praise the Lord, he's alive, alive. Sister Catherine laughed and sobbed as she fumbled at the door. The dead child flailed blindly through the bars. He sees me. He knows me. He's alive. If there is anything left of David in there. Gibbons shuddered. Jett walked up to Gibbons and wordlessly offered her something. A key. Gibbons shook her head quickly and walked to Sister Catherine. She put a hand on Sister Catherine's shoulder. No, she said. He isn't. I'm sorry. But you see, don't you? Sister Catherine said desperately, turning to address her words to all of them. He is. The others are dead, but they were dead flesh, like you said. Not my boy. Not my Davy. Gibbons reached into her pocket and pulled out her small silver flask. No, she repeated unhappily. If he drinks this, you'll see. She held out the flask to Sister Catherine. What is it? Sister Catherine demanded sharply, her eyes narrowing in suspicion. Nothing but salt water, Gibbons answered softly. Just plain salt water. You have to tell him to drink it, Jett said. He'll do it if you ask. You're his mother. Of course I am, Sister Catherine said, laughing a little, as if Jett had made a joke. She took the little flask from Gibbons and unscrewed the top. She took a sip of its contents to test it, then turned back to the cell. You're alive, Davy, she said, holding the flask through the bars. I know you are. All you have to do is prove it to them by drinking this. And then we can be together. We can be happy. I told you I'd find a doctor for you. I told you I wouldn't let you suffer. Just drink this. That's all you have to do. Was there a kind of dull desperation in those eyes? Gibbons thought there was. The thing fastened its blind gaze on the flask. Does it know? How can it know? Impossible, of course, and yet, Gibbons thought she saw a spark of something in that dead gaze. Hope. His mother was still talking, promising her son what they'd do, where they'd go, when the child zombie clumsily pawed the silver flask from her hands, as if the flask held the water of life. It held it awkwardly between its palms and tipped it up to pour the contents into its mouth. It fell backward, dropping the flask. Dead. Sister Catherine began to scream, clutching the bars and shaking the cell door. Jett shoved her sideways and thrust the key into the lock. Sister Catherine yanked the door open and rushed inside. She fell to her knees and gathered the lifeless body into her arms. Wake up, Davy, she said, rocking him. It's time to wake up. You're cured. You're healed. He promised me. He promised. Wake up. Prove to them how wrong they are. Oh, please, please, please wake up. Gibbons felt her eyes sting and her throat close a little. The poor child and his poor mother. She blinked the tears away with determination. Crying would do nothing to change what had happened, and David had been doomed in any case. Shepherd had made a promise he'd known he could not keep. No one could cure consumption. Yet. And so he'd lied and given the boy's mother false hope. That was worse than letting the child die. She made a mental note to add medical research to the scope of her investigations. In a proper world, a scientific world, there would be no Davids, no Sister Catherines, no desperate parents watching their children die of 100 diseases. If that bastard wasn't already dead, I'd kill him myself, Gibbons snarled, so low only Jett could hear. I'd help you, Jett said grimly. Then, to Gibbons's faint surprise, she crossed herself and began to speak, her lips moving as she whispered almost soundlessly. Inclina domini, orum tuum ad preces nostras. Gibbons translated the words automatically. Incline thy ear, O Lord, to the prayers with which we suppliantly entreat thy mercy. It was a prayer for the dead. It was the end of April, and even at mid-morning the temperature was oven-like. The steady wind provided no relief from the heat, and Gibbons thought longingly of San Francisco's cool breezes. Thanks to her auto-tachopode, she would be home again within the week. Despite her eagerness to return to familiar surroundings, it was with a certain amount of regret that Gibbons made her last preparations for departure. Think they'll be all right? Jett asked, walking from the ranch house to stand beside Nightingale. The black stallion was saddled and ready to go. Deerfoot stood beside him. As all right as possible, Gibbons said. She picked up the spool of fuse cord and used a scrap of twine to tie the spool to the rear door of the auto-tachopode. The fuse ran across the compound and through the open doorway of the bunkhouse that led to the underground cavern. The best thing to do, they'd all decided, was to destroy all trace of Brother Shepherd's work and give the rest of the dead as decent a burial as possible under the circumstances. Among the things they discovered while searching Jerusalem's wall was more than a dozen kegs of gunpowder. Early this morning, Gibbons had run a length of fuse cord down to the makeshift powder magazine she'd constructed with White Fox's help in the underground complex. They can use Allsup as a starting point to resume their lives, or even become its new citizens, she continued, even if technically they are accessories to murder. What story could we tell that anyone would believe? White Fox finished as he, too, exited the house. He stepped to Deerfoot's side and vaulted onto her back in a single fluid motion. Jett snorted. I'm pretty sure making them tote corpses for a week was punishment enough, she said. She tucked the toe of her boot into the stirrup and swung onto Nightingale's back. The survivors of Jerusalem's wall had chosen to bury all their own dead in the cemetery in Allsup. The number of blessed resurrected, who had been friends or kin of the former members of the fellowship, had been shockingly large, And if they'd attempted to bury all of Shepard's alamatons, as well it would have taken months to dig enough graves. At Gibbons's suggestion, they'd placed the rest of the bodies in the dormitory building closest to the old bunkhouse. At least a couple of sacks of quicklime scattered over them had made the presence of the bodies bearable while the final investigation of Jerusalem's wall took place. While Jett and White Fox resettled Brother Shepard's former congregation in Alsop, Gibbons searched Shepard's resurrection chamber for information. She'd been troubled to discover Shepard had been in regular correspondence with someone who'd encouraged his theories on Musica Universalis and helped him to expand them. Unfortunately, he'd copied those letters into his personal journal and burned the originals, so the name and location of his correspondent remained a mystery. And to her disappointment, she'd found little about Shepard's actual method of creating and controlling his alamatons. Perhaps once I return to my own laboratory and examine my sample of the zombie cocktail, I will be able to discover the formula, she thought hopefully. I do not wish to borrow trouble, but until I have discovered the identity of Shepard's correspondent, I cannot be certain this plague of zombies has been ended once and for all. But at least it is ended here, and now I can tell Papa the disappearances have nothing to do with his phantom airships. And yet, Brother Shepard's followers truly weren't aware of Brother Shepard's crimes. White Fox said to Jett, "You did a good deed, Gibbons, to distribute his ill-gotten gains among them." Gibbons felt her cheeks warm at his praise. She looked quickly away. It wasn't as if any of us could or wished to carry it off with us. "And I abhor waste," she added uncomfortably. "You couldn't fit so much as a silver teaspoon of it into your buggy anyway," Jett pointed out. "Not with all those books and papers. Vital to my ongoing investigation," Gibbons said crisply, her composure restored. The auto-tachopode was indeed crammed full to bursting with the documents she'd salvaged from the resurrection chamber. She'd even lashed a trunk of papers to the roof. "Investigate all you want," Jett said. "Just don't make any more of those things." "No," Gibbons said, shuddering despite the warmth of the day. There was a moment of silence. The three of them looked at each other. "There's just one thing left to do," Gibbons said. She was confident that this detonation would obliterate all trace of the madness and horror that had taken place at Jerusalem's wall. While Jett and White Fox had been sure the gunpowder would be sufficient, Gibbons knew that neither of them was as well versed as she in the properties of explosive substances. Fortunately, Shepard's laboratory had contained extensive stocks of sulfuric acid, glycerin, and white fuming nitric acid. It had been a simple matter for one of her education and training to use those chemicals to make pyroglycerin, or as it was now more commonly known in scientific circles, nitroglycerin. The volatile compound was not well known in the States as yet, though Mr. Ascanio Sobrero had first synthesized it at the University of Turin in 1847. It was far more potent than gunpowder, and she had made quite a large amount of it. Once the gunpowder exploded, it would set off the jars of nitroglycerin and bury the last evidence of Wilson Shepard's madness. As Jett and White Fox waited at a safe distance, Gibbons mounted the driver's bench of the auto-tachopode. Once she had, the other two rode to a safe distance. "Here goes nothing," Gibbons thought, taking a deep breath. But to her pleased delight, her machine started smoothly and more or less quietly. It really was both reliable and efficient. She released the brake and pushed the tiller forward. Gibbons's device could be useful once it is fully perfected. Such a conveyance will be able to reach places too distant or thinly settled for the railroads to go, White Fox mused as he watched the auto-tachopode approach. They were still too close to the compound to weather the explosion safely, but neither of them truly trusted the auto-tachopode not to quit at a very inconvenient moment. Their horses twitched their ears at the sound of its engine, but made no other sign they'd noticed it. Jett laughed. "I'll keep Nightingale. Horses don't explode, or run out of steam in the middle of nowhere. And they can get you where you're going even if you're sound asleep." "I suppose you're right," he said. "It isn't really very practical." White Fox studied Jett covertly from the corner of his eye. The young desperado on Nightingale's back wouldn't be taken for a girl on even the closest inspection. "What are your plans?" he asked at last. Gibbons had a home to return to, and even he had a home of sorts. "Head on up the trail," Jett said, shrugging. "I sure as shootin' don't want to be anywhere around Alsop once word gets out, whatever word that might be," Jett said. "This neck of the woods is going to be up to its ears in law after that." "And law? White Fox knew meant only one thing to Jett: the Union. The northern oppressors who had put down the rebellion of the southern states, and whose policies of reconstruction weighed so heavily upon them. Perhaps, White Fox agreed neutrally, though I suspect Brother Shepherd's former congregation will be grateful simply to forget the entire matter. Just as well, Jett said thoughtfully. This is 1867. Folks would have a powerful lot of trouble believing in a zombie army. I hope you're right, White Fox said. Shepherd had believed, and so had his unknown correspondent. As the auto-tachopode rolled toward them, the last of the fuse uncoiled from the spool attached to the back of the wagon and fell to the ground. Gibbons drew level with them and set the brake on her machine, then jumped down and ran back to the coiling end of the fuse. We're going to be here a while, Jett predicted, tilting her hat back. Too much wind out here to strike a light. I believe you underestimate Gibbons's resourcefulness, White Fox said mildly. They watched as Gibbons pulled a tin about the size of a deck of cards from her pocket. The match she struck not only caught fire instantly, it didn't blow out. She touched it to the end of the cord. There was a flare of light, and the end of the cord caught fire. In the sunlight, the tiny spark that sped down its length was nearly invisible. Gibbons turned and ran back to them, one hand holding her sunbonnet in place. Unencumbered by skirts or corset, she ran as fast as a young deer. What the devil did you light that with? Jett demanded. They're called safety matches, Gibbons said breathlessly as she clambered onto the driver's bench. They were invented by Mr. Gustav Erik Pask of Sweden, and they are far superior to both the common lucifer match and the so-called noiseless, or white phosphorus, match invented by. In a loud ratcheting of gears, the auto-tachopode moved grandly forward. Gibbons continued lecturing as she drove, but Jett knew by now there wasn't a subject under the sun that Gibbons didn't know upside down and backwards. Come sundown, she'd probably still be talking about the cousins and sisters and brothers of whatever newfangled match she'd used. Jett was more interested in what it had done. As the auto-tachopode's speed increased, Nightingale and Deerfoot moved from a walk to a canter. Seconds passed. Jett counted silently under her breath. It should reach the powder magazine just about. Suddenly there was a roar as fire and stone fountained into the sky. Even in the saddle, Jett could feel the ground shake. The force of the explosion took her completely by surprise. Nightingale reared, laid his ears flat back, and bolted. If it hadn't been for the possibility Gibbons's go-devil would refuse to move, requiring her or White Fox to drag Gibbons, undoubtedly protesting, to safety, Jett would have left the stallion somewhere further from the explosion. But now she didn't think Mexico would have been far enough, and that would probably have been where he stopped running if she weren't in the saddle. Easy, 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 she murmured until he finally slowed. She said she'd found some gunpowder, Jett thought weakly. And you dang fool, you took her at her word. She looked around. Deerfoot and White Fox were a few hundred yards behind her. He'd managed to get his mare to angle away from Nightingale, for if the two horses had been running neck and neck, they would have egged each other on. Behind her, she could see a huge billowing cloud of dust. Of course, Gibbons was turning the auto-tachopode around to head right back toward it. Jett stuck her fingers in her mouth and whistled shrilly, then yanked her hat off to wave it in Gibbons's direction. When she was sure White Fox had seen, she pulled the bandana around her neck up over her nose and mouth and turned Nightingale back the way he'd come. He tossed his head reproachfully. I know, Jett said. Bet they heard that all the way to Atlanta. Come on. I need to keep that dangfool Yankee from killing herself, her and her dangfool science. Nightingale went as much sideways as forward as Jett coaxed him back the way they'd come. The dust was already starting to clear, or at least to be blown somewhere else by the steady desert wind. Jett could see tiny limestone pebbles scattered over the ground. They looked like out-of-season hail. She could see only the vague outline of the auto-tachopode now. It had headed directly into the dust cloud. Wait up, Jett shouted uselessly, over the racket of the engine. She spurred Nightingale to the gallop, still shouting. She overtook Gibbons and forced Nightingale across the wagon's path. Gibbons braked to a halt in a squeal of machinery. Jett saw with vague astonishment that she was wearing a sort of leather domino mask with what looked like spyglass lenses set in it. The engine noise dropped from an ear-splitting roar to a quieter idle, making it possible to converse, even though it required shouting. Where do you think you're going? Jett bellowed. All I was doing was, Gibbons broke off suddenly. Jett looked around quickly for the threat. The wagon and Nightingale were barely a dozen yards from the edge of a gigantic crater. "What the Sam Hill did you do?" Jett demanded. "I didn't think the gunpowder we found would be enough," Gibbons shouted. "I made some nitroglycerin to increase the force of the explosion. Hardly much at all. Nitroglycerin is much more powerful than gunpowder. It's the advance of science." "Science, my." A movement behind Gibbons drew Jett's attention. White Fox and Deerfoot appeared through the billowing dust, moving toward the auto-tacopode at a cautious walk. White Fox's hat and coat were white with dust. Jett looked down at her own clothes and snarled. She looked like somebody had hit her with a bag of flour. "She used science," Jett shouted to White Fox in exasperation. White Fox nodded silently, signifying he'd heard. The three of them sat in silence for some time, just watching. As the dust cloud rolled majestically northward, herded by the wind, the scope of the destruction became visible. Jett knew what the ground looked like where a cannonball had hit. This was the same crater magnified 1,000-fold. More, the bottom of the crater was mounded with broken stone, and despite her immediate irritation at nearly having been blown to glory, Jett was privately relieved at the size of the explosion. She could hear the clicking and sliding of the stones in the crater as they settled. There was no longer any sign of any of the buildings that had once been Jerusalem's wall, or of the catacombs beneath it and their contents. "Nobody's ever going to be able to figure out what that Sidewinder was doing here now," Gibbons said in satisfaction. Her words were an uncanny echo of Jett's thoughts. "Sidewinder." Jett shot back, repressing a grin. "Listen to you. If you aren't careful, you're going to go native on us." "No chance of that," Gibbons said feelingly. "I like clean sheets, hot food, and a roof over my head." "Except when you are tracking a mystery," White Fox teased. Gibbons favored him with a radiant smile of agreement. "Sure I can't persuade either of you to come back to San Francisco with me?" she asked, sounding hopeful. White Fox shook his head. With a certain amount of reluctance, Jett thought. "I must return to Fort Riley," he said. "I've been absent from my duties for too long, and I owe Caleb Lincoln the answer he sent me to find, sad news though it will be." He glanced toward Jett. "You are more than welcome to come with me." Jett was already shaking her head. "Got no use for Yankee soldiers, beg pardon," she said. "Figure I'll head on up the trail and see what's there." She hesitated, then touched the brim of her hat to Gibbons in salute. "I reckon this is goodbye for sure then. For all of us." Despite her constant complaints, Jett knew she'd miss the spunky Yankee firebrand. And White Fox, well, no use crying for the moon. Besides, her brother was out here. Somewhere. "Maybe it's goodbye and maybe it isn't," Gibbons said. "I have a feeling we might just meet again. All three of us." "Don't tell me you believe in woman's intuition?" Jett asked mockingly. "Call it a scientific theory," Gibbons answered lightly, and White Fox smiled. "Then I won't say goodbye," Jett said. "I'll say via con Dios instead." "Go with God, Jett Gallatin," White Fox answered. Jett turned Nightingale and spurred him to a trot. She was almost too far away to hear when the ear-splitting sound of the auto-tacopode's engine reached her ears. "I wonder if she's right." "Come on, partner. We're burning daylight," she shouted, and Nightingale moved from a trot to a gallop. The sound of his hoofbeats drowned out all other sounds.